A mother dog rushes into a police station with her puppies. The officer's reaction is shocking. The small-town police station was quiet that night, the low hum of the radio filling the air, as Officer Jake Lawson leaned back in his chair, his fingers lazily drumming against the desk. Outside, the rain drizzled steadily, painting the streets in a glossy sheen under the flickering streetlights. It had been a slow evening. No bar fights, no reckless teenagers, not even a wandering deer causing trouble on the roads. Just the kind of night Jake appreciated, one where he could sip his lukewarm coffee in peace and half listen to his partner, Officer Reed, complain about his ex-wife. The sudden bang at the station's front doors shattered the tranquility. It wasn't a knock or a visitor pushing them open. It was a forceful, desperate impact, followed by a frantic scratching. Jake shot up, the coffee forgotten as he reached for the door handle. The second he cracked it open, something darted inside, wet paws sliding against the tile floor as the creature collapsed in a heap just beyond the threshold. Jake's breath hitched as he took in the sight. A German shepherd lay panting, her ribs rising and falling in ragged gasps, her soaked fur clinging to her trembling body. Her golden brown eyes locked onto his, pleading, terrified, but determined. It took him a second to register the tiny bundle clutched in her jaws. A puppy, just a few weeks old, weakly squirming. "What the?" Reed muttered, stepping closer. The dog let out a sharp whimper, her eyes darting between them and the door. Then, with a sudden jolt of energy, she pushed herself up and staggered back outside into the rain. Jake followed instinctively, heart pounding, barely registering the way the cold air cut through his uniform. The dog wasn't running away. She was retrieving another tiny bundle from the sidewalk, struggling against the weight of exhaustion. Jake dropped to his knees, reaching out slowly, but she wouldn't let go of the pup until she had crossed the threshold again, placing the fragile body beside the first. Then, as if powered by pure will alone, she turned and ran back into the storm. By the time she returned with the third, Jake had already grabbed towels and a dry blanket from the back room. Reed had placed the first two puppies on the soft fabric, his tough demeanor shaken as he gently rubbed them dry. The mother dog barely acknowledged them before stumbling outside once more. "How many more?" Reed muttered, shaking his head. Jake didn't answer. He was already at the door, his chest tightening as he watched the struggling mother vanish down the street. He knew exhaustion when he saw it. She was pushing herself beyond her limits, past the point where her body should have given out, fueled only by the desperate need to keep her babies safe. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. Just as Jake was about to step outside and search for her, a shadow appeared against the glow of the streetlights. She was dragging herself forward now, her paws slipping, her breathing labored. The fourth puppy was barely moving. Jake ran to meet her, dropping to his knees as she collapsed against him. "That's it, girl," he whispered, gently lifting the puppy from her mouth, cradling it close to his chest. "You did good. You did real good." For a moment she stayed pressed against him, her damp fur soaking into his uniform, her body quivering with exhaustion. Then she pulled back just enough to lock eyes with him again, something urgent still burning beneath the fatigue. Jake swore his heart cracked in half when she turned, her legs buckling, and tried to go back outside. "Oh, hell no," he muttered. "Reed, grab her." Reed was already moving, stepping forward just as the mother dog collapsed mid-stride. He scooped her up before she could protest, carrying her gently toward the warmth of the station. She didn't fight, just whimpered, her body giving up before her spirit could. The puppies were bundled together in blankets now, their tiny chests rising and falling, their cries growing softer as warmth seeped into their bodies. The mother dog barely lifted her head to check on them before her eyes fluttered shut. Jake knelt beside her, rubbing warmth back into her paws. He could see her bones too clearly beneath her fur, the signs of malnutrition glaring even through the wet sheen of rain. His gut twisted. "Someone did this to her," he murmured. Reed exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Damn right they did. And she ran until she found help." Jake glanced down at the exhausted mother, at the way she had finally surrendered to sleep now that her babies were safe. "She found us." It wasn't until the door creaked open that he realized just how quiet the station had become. Officer Murphy stood there, his face scrunched in confusion. Why the hell is there a family reunion happening in the middle of the squad room? Jake shot him a glare. Shut up and grab the extra space heater from the break room. Murphy blinked at the bundle of damp fur on the floor, at the 4 tiny lives curled against their mother, and to Jake's satisfaction, he didn't argue. Minutes later, the heat filled the space, chasing away the last clutches of cold. The mother dog stirred slightly, her ears twitching. Jake stroked her head gently, watching as she sighed, finally allowing herself a moment of peace. Then he noticed something that made the unease creep back into his gut. Her ears twitched again, not from comfort, but from instinct. She was listening. Jake frowned, following her gaze toward the front door. The rain still poured outside, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. And parked just at the edge of the station's perimeter, barely visible through the mist, was a black truck. The engine was running. Jake's muscles tensed as he stared through the glass, his eyes locking onto the black truck sitting just outside the station's perimeter. The streetlights flickered against the rain-slick pavement, casting ghostly reflections along the truck's surface. It wasn't moving. It just sat there, engine humming low as if waiting. A cold unease slithered down his spine. The mother dog, Luna as he decided to call her, let out a weak whimper, her ears twitching even in exhaustion. She knew that truck. That much was clear. Reed noticed the change in Jake's posture and followed his line of sight. "That's the same one from earlier, isn't it?" he muttered, voice edged with suspicion. Jake gave a slow nod, his jaw tightening. "Yeah." Without another word, he pushed himself to his feet and strode toward the door, adjusting his belt as he moved. Rain pattered against the glass as he stepped out into the cool night, his boots splashing against the wet pavement. The moment he made his way off the curb, the truck's headlights flicked on, casting a blinding white beam through the darkness. Jake shielded his eyes for a second before raising a hand, signaling for them to stop. For a breathless moment, the truck didn't move. The engine growled, low and steady, like an animal watching its prey. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the tires screeched against the wet asphalt, and the vehicle peeled away, disappearing down the empty street. Jake cursed under his breath, running back inside as the rain soaked into his uniform. "They took off," he said, shaking the water from his sleeves. Reed was already at the monitor, rewinding the security footage. "Plates are covered," he grumbled, pausing the screen. The grainy image showed the truck just before it sped away, its windows tinted, its details obscured, deliberate in its anonymity. "Whoever they are, they don't want to be seen." Jake ran a hand over his face, frustration curling tight in his chest. His gaze flickered to Luna, who lay curled protectively around her puppies, her sides rising and falling in exhausted, shallow breaths. Even in sleep, she twitched, her ears flicking at every distant sound. She was still afraid. Whatever, or whoever, she had run from wasn't finished with her yet. Murphy returned from the back, hands stuffed in his pockets, his usual smirk absent. "Break room heaters set up. They're finally warming up." His gaze dropped to Luna, and for once his voice softened. "She's been through hell." Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "And I think she's still running." He turned back to Reed. "We need to figure out where she came from. Any reports of missing dogs lately?" Reed had already started digging. "No microchip," he muttered, eyes scanning the database. "No collars, no tags. But that truck isn't some coincidence. Someone's looking for her." He typed faster, scrolling through pages of recent complaints. "Hold up." He stopped, eyes narrowing. 2 weeks ago, a guy a few towns over reported a dogfighting operation. Didn't leave a name, just an anonymous tip. Said he saw a setup in an old warehouse off Route 19. Cops checked it out, but the place was cleared before they arrived. Jake's stomach twisted. "You think she escaped from something like that?" Reed turned the monitor toward him, showing a few attached photos, ones taken before the place was abandoned. Blood-stained floors, chains, cages stacked on top of each other. "If she ran from a place like this," Reed said, voice grim, "she's lucky to be alive." Jake's fist clenched at his sides. He looked at Luna again, at the deep scars hidden beneath her damp fur, at the way she curled herself protectively around her puppies even in sleep. His stomach burned. The thought of what she had likely endured, what she had fought to keep her babies away from, made his blood simmer. "We're checking that warehouse in the morning," he said, his voice steely. "I want to see it for myself." Reed nodded, but before either of them could say more, the soft sound of whimpering filled the room. Luna stirred, shifting her head, her breathing suddenly ragged. Her front paws twitched as if she were running, a soft whine escaping her throat. Jake crouched beside her, resting a cautious hand against her head. "Easy, girl," he murmured. She shuddered under his touch, her body tense, caught in whatever nightmare held her captive. Then in a sharp, broken gasp, she jolted awake, eyes wide with panic. Her breath came fast, her muscles trembling. But when she saw Jake, her wild expression flickered with recognition. She didn't cower. She didn't growl. She just stared at him, searching, uncertain. Jake stayed still, his palm resting against her fur, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now," he said. Luna exhaled shakily, lowering her head. Slowly her body relaxed, her breathing evening out. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. She trusted him, at least a little. And trust, he knew, didn't come easy to dogs who had seen the worst of humanity. The night stretched on, and the station remained quiet except for the occasional rustle of movement from the kennel area, where Luna and her puppies now rested. But outside, beyond the warm walls of safety, beyond the glow of the streetlights, the town remained drenched in shadows. Somewhere out there, someone was looking for her. Jake had no intention of letting them find her first. Morning came sluggishly, dragging gray light through the rain-streaked windows of the station. The town was still, wrapped in the quiet lull of early hours. But inside, the tension had settled thick as fog. Jake sat at his desk, fingers wrapped around a mug of stale coffee, eyes flicking between the security feed and the sleeping form of Luna curled around her pups. She hadn't stirred much after her nightmare, exhaustion pinning her in place. But every so often, her ears twitched, her body coiling tighter as if preparing for the worst. Jake understood that feeling, the kind that settled deep in your bones, a constant readiness for danger even when it wasn't there. He had felt it before, during his years in the force, that unease creeping into his gut whenever something didn't sit right. And this didn't sit right. Reed walked in, rubbing a hand over his face, looking just as tired as Jake felt. "Ran those plates again. Nothing. Whoever owns that truck, they're covering their tracks real well." He grabbed his own coffee, took a sip, grimaced, and set it down like it personally offended him. "You still set on checking out that warehouse?" Jake glanced at Luna. The rise and fall of her ribs was steady now, but even in sleep, she had positioned herself between her pups and the door. Protective, always ready. Whatever hell she had escaped, it hadn't let go of her yet. Jake drained the rest of his coffee and stood. "Yeah, let's move." The drive out to Route 19 was silent except for the occasional crackle of the radio and the low hum of the tires against wet pavement. The further they got from town, the emptier the landscape became. The roads flanked by skeletal trees and abandoned lots, the kind of place where things happened in secret. Reed kept his eyes on the road, but Jake could see his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, restless energy bleeding through. "You think she really came from here?" Reed asked finally. "Or are we just chasing ghosts?" Jake's grip tightened against his knee. "I think she came from somewhere worse." The warehouse loomed at the end of a narrow dirt road, its metal siding rusted, its windows long shattered. The place had been stripped clean, hollowed out like the carcass of something long dead. Jake stepped out of the cruiser, mud sucking at his boots as he approached the entrance. The heavy door hung slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open, the stale air inside thick with the scent of damp wood and oil. Reed flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim interior. The place was empty, mostly. Trash littered the corners, old crates stacked along the walls. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on Jake's arms rise. Faint stains marred the concrete floor, darker patches where the rain hadn't reached. The metal rings bolted to the walls, some still holding scraps of frayed rope. A metal cage, Door bent inward as if something had fought its way out. Jake crouched, running his fingers over deep scratches in the floor, the desperate claw marks of an animal that had been here too long. His stomach turned. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a graveyard of suffering. Reed exhaled sharply, shaking his head. God damn! He kicked at a torn collar lying near the wall, its leather stained, the buckle rusted. You were right. This place was a fight ring. Jake stood, jaw clenched. Not was. Still is. They just moved. Reed frowned, glancing around. Then why come back here? That truck, those guys looking for Luna. Why show up at the station? Jake ran a hand through his hair, the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming something uglier than he wanted to admit. She got out, he said finally. Maybe she wasn't the only one. Maybe she wasn't supposed to make it this far. Reed's face darkened. You think she's the last loose end? Jake didn't answer, but the thought settled in his gut like a stone. He turned, scanning the space again, his eyes catching something half buried beneath a pile of discarded tarps. He pulled it free, a splintered wooden sign, its letters faded but still legible. Black Ridge Kennels. Reed whistled low. That's a name we can trace. Jake took a picture of the sign, then tossed it back to the ground. His gut told him they wouldn't find much in official records. Places like this didn't leave easy trails. But they had a lead now. And Luna? Luna was the proof they needed. The drive back to town was quieter than before, heavy with the weight of what they'd seen. When they pulled into the station lot, Jake's stomach twisted. The truck was back. This time, it wasn't parked in the shadows. It was right there, in plain sight, as if daring them to act. Two men leaned against the hood, both dressed in dark jackets, their expressions unreadable. The taller one, his face lean and sharp, pushed off the truck and sauntered forward, hands stuffed into his pockets. His eyes flicked toward the building, and Jake knew exactly what he was looking for. You boys got something that belongs to us, the man said, voice smooth, almost amused. Jake stepped forward, shoulders squared. I don't think so. The man clicked his tongue, shaking his head. Come on now, no need for that. We're just here to collect what's ours. His gaze flicked to the side, landing on Reed. You understand, don't you? Reed folded his arms. I understand you need to leave before we arrest you for trespassing. The second man moved then, shorter but built solid, the type who probably didn't talk much because he let his fists do it for him. He stepped closer, his stance shifting, tension crackling like a live wire. You got no right keeping her, he muttered. She's ours. Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. She's not property, he said. She's not yours. The taller man sighed as if this was all just some minor inconvenience. Look, officer, I don't want trouble. We just need the dog. And the pups. Jake's pulse roared in his ears. And the pups. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. That was all he needed to hear. These bastards weren't just here for revenge. They were here to take back what they saw as profit. His stomach turned. You're not getting near them. The air between them stretched tight. Then the taller man exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath. Shame, he said. Would have been easier if you just handed them over. He turned, jerking his head toward the truck. Come on, we're done here. Jake didn't relax, didn't let his stance shift until the truck peeled away, tires spitting gravel as they disappeared into the streets. Even then, the tension sat thick in his chest. They weren't done. Reed let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. That was a threat. Jake nodded, eyes dark. Yeah, and they'll be back. He turned toward the station, his mind already made up. If they wanted Luna and her pups, they'd have to go through him first. Jake didn't sleep that night. The encounter outside the station played on repeat in his mind, every word laced with threat, every movement from those men calculated. They weren't done. That much he knew. The way they had stood there, waiting, demanding Luna and the pups as if they had a right to them. It made his blood boil. He sat at his desk, fingers curled around a lukewarm cup of coffee, his eyes locked on the security feed. The streets were quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that felt wrong. Too forced, too expectant, like the calm before a storm. Luna lay curled up in the corner, her body wrapped around her pups, her ears twitching every time the wind rattled the windows. She knew too. She had felt it long before Jake had. That primal sense of danger, the knowledge that something lurked just out of reach, waiting. He could see it in the way she rested. Never fully relaxed, never fully at ease. Even in sleep, her body remained tense, coiled, ready to act. Reed had tried to talk him into heading home for a few hours, but Jake refused. He wasn't leaving them unprotected. Not when he could feel trouble pressing in from all sides. He had seen what those men were capable of, and he knew that if they had the chance, they would take back what they thought belonged to them. The idea of Luna and her pups falling back into their hands made his stomach churn. The clock on the wall read just past 3 in the morning when the first sign of trouble came. A flicker on the security feed, movement near the back entrance. Jake stiffened, setting his coffee down without a sound, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. He watched as a shadow slithered through the dim light. Someone careful. Someone who knew how to move unseen. He rose from his chair, moving silently across the station, Reed already mirroring his movements. The two officers exchanged a glance before Jake pushed open the side door, stepping into the cold night air. The station's lot was empty except for their patrol cars, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. But he could feel it. Someone was here. A scuff of movement to his left, a flicker of motion near the alley. Jake turned just in time to see a dark figure bolting toward the kennels. Without thinking, he moved, sprinting after them, his boots pounding against the wet ground. The suspect was fast, but Jake had the advantage of knowing the terrain. He cut through the alley, rounding the corner just as the figure reached the kennel door. Luna was already awake, her low, guttural growl cutting through the night as she pressed against the cage, her body a shield in front of her pups. The intruder fumbled with something, a lockpick, a crowbar, desperation in their movements. But they never got the chance to finish. Jake crashed into them, sending them sprawling into the wet pavement. The man let out a grunt, twisting beneath Jake's grip, but he wasn't getting away. Jake had him pinned, knee pressing hard against his back, his hands wrenching the man's wrist behind him. "Real bad choice," Jake growled, breath coming fast. Reed caught up a second later, gun drawn, eyes sharp. "You got him?" "Yeah," Jake muttered, yanking the guy's hood back. The man was younger than he expected, maybe mid-20s, his face lined with the kind of wear that came from running with the wrong people. His lip was split, eyes darting between the two officers, with the look of someone who had gambled and lost. "You alone?" Jake demanded. The man didn't answer, jaw clenching. Reed knelt beside them, pressing the barrel of his gun against the pavement as he exhaled. "You were breaking into a police station, genius. That's a felony. If you don't want us digging deeper into who sent you, now's the time to start talking." Still, the man said nothing, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow breaths. Jake's patience was wearing thin. He tightened his grip, voice low. "I know you didn't come here on your own. You're not the one calling the shots. So why don't you tell us who is before they decide you're more of a liability than an asset?" Something flickered in the man's eyes. Hesitation, maybe even fear. But before he could say anything, a sound split the night. The roar of an engine. Jake barely had time to register it before headlights flooded the alley. Bright, blinding. He turned just in time to see the black truck barreling toward them. "Move!" Reed shouted. Jake wrenched the suspect back just as the truck skidded to a stop, the passenger door flying open. Two men leaped out, one armed with a crowbar, the other with something worse, a knife that glinted under the streetlight. The man beneath Jake used the moment of distraction to twist free, scrambling to his feet before throwing himself toward the waiting truck. Jake barely had time to react before the guy with the knife lunged. He dodged left, the blade missing his side by inches, the air slicing cold against his skin. He retaliated fast, his fist colliding with the man's ribs, sending him stumbling. Reed took on the other one, the sound of fists meeting flesh sharp in the night. The scuffle was fast, brutal, but they were outnumbered, and these bastards weren't afraid to fight dirty. Jake caught movement from the corner of his eye, the truck's driver reaching for something under his seat. Gun. Everything slowed. Jake lunged for his own weapon, but before he could draw, a blur of movement cut across the lot. Luna. She had forced the kennel gate open, her body low, her growl turning into a feral snarl as she tore across the pavement. She didn't hesitate, didn't slow, just launched herself at the man with the gun. The impact sent them both sprawling, the weapon skidding from his grip. Luna was on him in an instant, teeth flashing, snapping, the sound of her fury filling the night. The man screamed, kicking out, scrambling back, fear wild in his eyes. Reed recovered first, his gun finally drawn, aim steady. "Don't move," he ordered, voice sharp. The other two didn't need to be told twice. They froze, hands raised, eyes darting between Reed and Luna, who still stood poised, hackles raised, teeth bared. Jake caught his breath, his heart still hammering. They had come for her, they had come for the pups, but they hadn't expected her to fight back, and now they had lost. Reed radioed for backup, and within minutes, flashing lights filled the lot, officers swarming, cuffing the men, securing the scene. Luna still stood rigid, her body trembling, adrenaline pouring off her in waves. Jake crouched beside her, voice steady. "It's okay," he murmured. "You did good." She turned to him then, her eyes locking onto his, something deep, something raw passing between them. For the first time, she didn't look like she was running. For the first time, she looked like she had won. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the station in an eerie glow, sirens cutting through the night as officers secured the scene. Jake stood in the middle of it all, his pulse still pounding in his ears, his breath sharp from the rush of adrenaline. Luna was at his side, her body tense but no longer trembling, her chest rising and falling in steady, controlled breaths. Her fur was slick from the rain, her muscles still coiled with the last remnants of the fight. But she had done it. She had stood her ground, protected what was hers, and for the first time since she had burst through the station doors, she wasn't running anymore. Jake crouched beside her, resting a hand against her head, and she leaned into his touch just slightly, just enough to let him know she understood. Reed was overseeing the arrests, watching as the three men who had tried to take Luna and the pups were shoved into the backs of separate patrol cars. The truck had been searched, weapons confiscated, and more than enough evidence collected to tie them to something bigger. But Jake knew these weren't the ones in charge. They were the muscle, the expendable hands sent to do the dirty work. And that meant whoever was running the operation wasn't done looking for Luna. Not yet. "You good?" Reed asked, stepping up beside him, arms crossed. Jake exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, you?" Reed scoffed. "Took a couple punches, but I'll live." More worried about her. He nodded toward Luna, who was now licking one of the scratches on her foreleg, the aftermath of the fight finally setting in. "She's tough," Jake said, watching her carefully. "But we need to make sure she doesn't have any real injuries." He stood, glancing toward one of the officers finishing up reports. "I want someone watching her kennel at all times. If they came once, they might come again." Reed nodded, rubbing his jaw. "We've got them on trespassing, assault, attempted theft. But it's not enough. Not for the people running this." Jake knew he was right. The fight wasn't over just because these three were in cuffs. He looked back at Luna, at the way she curled protectively around her pups, her body still positioned like a shield even though the danger had passed. She knew it too. She had lived it longer than any of them had. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and investigations. The more they dug into the Black Ridge Kennel's name, the worse the picture became. Reports of stolen dogs, illegal fights, and unspeakable cruelty. The organization was bigger than they thought, spanning across multiple states, with ties to underground rings that had been operating for years. And at the center of it, Jake realized, was Luna. She wasn't just a runaway. She was a survivor. She was evidence. And more than that, she had defied them. News of the arrests spread through the town quickly, and before Jake knew it, people were stopping by the station, asking about Luna and her pups. Donations of blankets, food, and supplies piled up in the break room. The local vet, hearing about what had happened, offered to treat Luna and her puppies for free. The town rallied behind her, turning her into something bigger than just a stray who had shown up one night. She was a symbol now, a story of survival and resilience, and Jake knew that no matter what happened next, she wouldn't be forgotten. But there was still one more thing to do. It was a week after the attack when Jake made his decision. He stood outside Luna's kennel, watching as she played with her pups. Her body finally relaxed, her tail wagging slightly as they tumbled over each other. She was healing, her strength returning, her spirit unbroken. Jake crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Luna," he said softly. Her ears perked, those golden brown eyes lifting to meet his. "You've been through a lot," he continued, voice steady, calm. "But you don't have to keep running anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a collar, simple but sturdy, with a tag that gleamed in the light. One word was engraved on it. Luna. She watched him, her head tilting slightly as if considering. Jake held out his hand, waiting, giving her the choice. And after a long moment, she stepped forward, pressing her nose against his palm. That was all the answer he needed. Reed found him later that evening, standing outside the station with Luna sitting beside him, the collar snug around her neck. "So that's it?" Reed asked, amusement in his voice. "You're keeping her?" Jake scratched behind Luna's ears, feeling her tail thump lightly against his boot. "She found me," he said simply. "Not the other way around." Reed chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess that means we're stuck with her." Jake glanced down at Luna, at the way she sat there. No longer cowering, no longer afraid. "Yeah," he murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think we are." The fight ring was dismantled within weeks, arrests stacking up as more information surfaced. The Blackridge Kennel's name was wiped from existence, its leaders facing the justice they had long evaded. But even as the headlines faded, Luna's story remained, a quiet legend in the town, a testament to survival, to resilience, to the unbreakable bond between a dog and those who chose to stand beside her. And for the first time in a long time, Luna was home.